Welcome to the Long Run, Episode 2, the one about the Sydney Marathon of 2024. I'm sure these videos will get better as I get more practice. A bit like running, really, or Star Wars. It didn't really get good until Episode 4. What can I say? I'm a bit late to this party. Looking around YouTube, it seems like about half the people who ran the Sydney Marathon have posted videos already. My only excuse is that I ran into some problems with DaVinci Resolve and had to start over from scratch. Must be a newbie. But I'm pretty confident that what you'll find here will not simply repeat what everyone else has said. All right, maybe there'll be a little bit of repeating, but also some new stuff. And you get to hear what went wrong on the day for me, and I'm pretty sure you won't hear that anywhere else. So let's start with the start. 6 a.m. is early, but starting at 7 a.m. last year proved a bad decision on a hot day, so it was necessary to start that early. But it does mean you're up well before that to get to the race. I was leaving home around 4, and I was the only person waiting at the light rail stop. But when I got on the light rail, there were at least some others foolish enough to be heading to North Sydney at this ridiculous hour, comforted by the warmth of the tram. I thought that sounded slightly poetic. By the time I was heading out of the metro station at North Sydney, there were plenty of others with me. Now, the organisers wanted the A wave at the start just after 5 a.m. So I left home with plenty of time to spare because last year there were about 1 billion people crowded onto the train platform. But even leaving at 4 a.m, there were plenty of other runners making their way to the start. But a good sign of how early I really was this. I was able to get to a loo without queuing. The organisers had also provided something called a whiz wall for people who urinate standing up. Seemed a good way to improve the throughput on the facilities. Well, it didn't quite solve all the problems. There were a couple of runners relieving themselves against a wall at the starting zone, and a few more in the bushes at Milson's Point as we approached Sydney Harbour Bridge. I doubt that'll make it to the official video reel for the race. But perhaps one thing struck me more than anything else. It was cold. No, it was freezing. It shouldn't have been a surprise, of course. Here's the headline from a local news website. And here's what my phone showed when I arrived at the start area. See that? Feels like 2 degrees. Ouch. Now, I know if you're from a colder climate, you probably scoff at this. But for someone who lives in Sydney, it was very, very cold. I know what you're thinking. You just can't make some people happy. Last year it was too hot. This year it was too cold. But I was slightly worried I'd suffer frostbite before starting the run. Anyway, I tried to stand close to one of the generators they had running to power the lights at the start in a desperate attempt to steal some of its heat, but I was overcome by the fumes and had to return to my igloo and await the start, hoping my joints would thaw at some point. From where we were corralled for the start, we couldn't see the start line or really hear the start for the elite group at 6 a.m. The Wave A start was a few minutes later, but as you can see here, I pretty much failed to notice that we'd moved to the point where we could start. And then I just looked up to see almost no one left. Still, it did mean I managed to avoid the crowds at the start, and my confusion definitely helped. Well, in addition to being cold, it was windy, and the wind, of course, made it feel colder. The wind was at its worst running south down Anzac Parade. Unfortunately, by this stage of the run, my camera was not behaving. It probably frozen or something. So you have to use your imagination to picture the view. Despite running for a couple of hours at this point, I still had not worked up a sweat. In spite of all this, the experience of running over the Sydney Harbour Bridge at sunrise is pretty much unbeatable, although the sunrise last year was even better than it was this year. And actually, the first half of the marathon takes place around the city. So although it has the most undulating terrain, by which I mean there's where the hills seem to be, it also is the most picturesque. It is, of course, capped off when the entire course returns to the city near the end for a finish at the Opera House.
We saw a bit of rain on Friday. My cousin said that.
Now, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it was cold. At this point, I was a little jealous of the few runners who ran in weird costumes. At least they might have been a bit warmer. But I was not jealous of the runners in swimwear, including one gentleman in a mankini. I can't imagine how bad the chafing must have been. Anyway, short of arranging warmer weather, event organisation was pretty spot on. Things ran smoothly, there were adequate toilets, adequate supplies at drink stations, they were spread out enough. Clearly lessons had been learned since last. But now for the bad news. I didn't expect a PB, and I didn't get one. I got to 32 kilometres, and then this.
New plan, calf muscle packed it in at 32 kilometres, so my aim is to walk it in by 4 hours. See how we do.
Of course, I'm not complaining, but, well, actually I am complaining a bit, but I did get to the finish line in under 4 hours. I guess I'll have to leave a PB until the next marathon. But always look on the bright side of life. I did better than Kipchoge in his last marathon. It's just a point I want to make. I did better than the guy who held the world record just about a year ago. Now that's pretty impressive. And if you finished, of course, you're in the same boat. I got my medal, I got to put on some warm clothes, and I got to go and celebrate with a scone, cream, jam, and hot tea. So for the run itself, that's about all I've got. But among other things, I'm a bit of a maths nerd, so it's almost inevitable that my review of the Sydney Marathon was going to delve into the numbers. But even if you're not interested in these details, the next bit might just make you feel better about your results anyway. Of course, it might make you feel worse, but let's just focus on the positive. Now, I'm aware that I'm past my prime as a runner. Well, unless you go by my age, which is a prime number. Now, if I had the same level of fitness in my 30s that I have now, relative to my peers, I'd expect to finish a marathon in less time than I could now. Now, I don't own a DeLorean or a TARDIS, or I can't manage a quantum leap, if you know. So I can't travel back in time to find out how I would have done, since I didn't run any marathons back then. But perhaps there's some other way to estimate how I would have done. I think I've worked something out. Bear with me for a few minutes. Here's a graph. Along the bottom of the graph, what we'll call the x-axis, is the number of seconds since the race started. 7,500 seconds is 2 hours and 5 minutes, and the time goes up as you go along the x-axis. The vertical axis shows the number of runners finishing at any point in the race. So in a category, the distribution will start low as the small number of really fast runners make it to the end. As time goes on, the number of runners crossing the line goes up, and it gets pretty busy in the middle when heaps of people are finishing. But later still, when most runners are finished, there's a tail end of quite slow runners, and there the graph tapers off towards zero. This is called a log normal distribution. We can plot such a graph for each of the age or gender categories in the marathon. And if this curve depicts my age category, then I can also mark on it where I finished in that category. So, for example, here. Now, what if we draw the graph for the fastest age category? They're faster, so the entire curve shifts a bit to the left. They all finish a bit sooner. If I then mark a line on this graph that's the same percent of the way through the cohort, then it too moves to the left. And this then shows me where I would have finished if I were at the same relative fitness compared to the remainder of my now much younger cohort of runners. So this is my way to estimate the time I could have achieved back in my prime. Now, if you want to check out how you could have done in your prime or how your results scale, you can. Just head over to the Long Run website. That's thelongrun.run. There's a link below. On the front page, select from the Marathon Stats menu option and choose London or Berlin marathons, because the more runners, the less statistical variation there's going to be in theory and the more precise the results. So let me select London in my example. We then see the data presented in a table of the categories and genders who finished in sufficient numbers to have vaguely statistically significant results. What I mean is that not all categories or genders are listed for all the marathon results I've gathered, and that's because the categories didn't have enough runners to be statistically significant. For example, in Sydney, there was one finisher over 90. He was the oldest, but he was not last, by the way. But one runner's not enough to get statistically reliable results. Any result would be nonsense. It would probably show the 90-year-old coming in at world record pace in his 20s, which might be true, but it might not. Back to the web page. If you look here at this example, you'll see across the top of the page, there's a section where you can specify your age category, gender, and finishing time. Now, if your category's not there, all I can suggest is choose the closest. If you're that one guy from the 90 to 94 age group at Sydney, you might have to choose 75 to 79. Sorry. Perhaps next year get some of your friends to come along and we'll get enough 90-year-olds in the run to produce some data. But in the meantime, choose the closest. And when you enter your details and press the Get Results button, you'll see the equivalent time that you would have run had you been at the same relative level of fitness in each of the other categories in the run. And so you see, if you ran 3 hours 20 and 30 seconds in the London Marathon, and you're a man aged between 55 and 59, the data tells us that you could have broken 3 hours if you were between 18 and 44. What's more, you're even on track to still be running under 5 hours in your 80s, which is not bad, let's face it. Now, if you check the Berlin results, remembering that Berlin is where more world records are set than anywhere else, then you're likely to do even better. So feel free to share your results either below or with friends and family. But even if you don't want to do that, remember to let them know that if you finished, then you did better than Kipchoge did in his last marathon. Anyway, gotta run. Thanks for watching and see you next time.